I am delighted to announce the conclusion of our delightful conference. And before I will say a few words of conclusion, I would like to introduce you to our new Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Elisheva Baumgarten. And Elisheva's own groundbreaking work on medieval Judaism has demonstrated that Jewish-Christian relations were, even in the Middle Ages, nuanced, multi-layered, and marked both by tension and proximity, perspectives that enrich our discussions today. And it's an opportunity to say that we're deeply appreciative of your support and of our faculty's broader commitment to advancing scholarship in the field of Jewish-Christian relations, both in the Middle Ages and today, and in each period, hopefully in the future as well. Thank you very much for coming, notwithstanding the very busy schedule. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so good evening. It's a tremendous pleasure to greet you all at this concluding session of the conference, marking the 60th anniversary of the Nostra Aetate Declaration. As Karma said, I welcome you not just as Dean of the Faculty, but also as a medievalist who specializes in Jewish-Christian relations in Europe. And I'm currently working on the 14th century with my own research group, and that was really a period of tremendous unrest, turmoil, and persecution, when Jewish and Christian relations deteriorated theologically and also on the ground. And one of the things we're trying to do in our research group is to understand how Jews responded and how they dealt with these issues in a day-to-day matter. And I'd say that as a scholar of Jewish-Christian relations, one of the issues I care most deeply about is the gap between ideology and practice. A breach that's sometimes paper thin, and at other times it's truly a chasm. And it works in both directions. In the Middle Ages, quite often, everyday relations continued while theologians came up with new and sometimes frightening doctrines. And at the same time, there were many cases in which local attacks on Jews intensified while the church defended the Jews. So if I move from 800 years ago, where I feel most comfortable, to now, to where you are, I would say that I'm not going to talk about the 20th century or the Nostra Aetate Declaration itself, or what led to it, or its aftermath. That is what you came together to do here, and I'm sure you did it very, very well. Instead, I want to say a few words about the here and now. So we have all experienced a horrific war over the past 2 years that has left scars and open wounds in Israel, in Gaza, and in the entire area. I think this war has also left a mark on all humans, because if I had to give some kind of qualification or some kind of description to this war, characterization, I would say that this was a war without any compassion. And compassion is a word that has a long history, both in the Christian world and I think in our world today. It was a war that started without mercy and continued without mercy. We still await the return of 3 hostages. We also need to mend what we can and learn to live with the damages this war caused. So many lives were lost. So many people's lives were torn apart. And as my friend John Goldberg Polin, the father of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, always says, and I quote this all the time, no one has a monopoly on pain. The pain is all of ours. And it is here that I think your conference brings us some hope, and the Nostra Aetate brings us some hope. And having this conference in Jerusalem brings us hope as well. Here in this city that is holy to 3 monotheistic religions, where blood has been shed so many times because of religious ideology, but where we also manage to live our daily lives together. When I go out for a run in the morning, I often count how many people of different religious denominations I see as I'm running around the old city, in the city of Jerusalem. So perhaps here we can find a path from the past to the present to a better future. These are the stakes of what we can achieve together. They are huge stakes, but they're also stakes that we can almost see, we can almost feel, we can almost understand what we're talking about. Nostra Aetate changed Jewish-Christian relations in so many ways. But here in the Middle East, of course, it's different than the ways Nostra Aetate was received in Europe or North America. Here in Israel, the Jews are majority, and the Christians are a minority. In other places in the world, in Europe where I feel at home, in North America where you can hear that I grew up, the Jews are a minority amongst the Christian majority. And there are still so many tensions that are left to be resolved, so many stereotypes, so many entrenched ideas. There is so much work that remains. But from the city that surrounds us, a city, if we were here during the day, you were here during the day, you can see the painful geography of the reality we live in through the window. We are also in a place of tremendous hope. When the Hebrew University was founded, first the Institute of Jewish Studies was founded, then the Oriental Institute was founded, and the study of religions is particularly strong here, from antiquity to modernity, through the land, the archaeology, and the holy texts. And here I think, in this place, that's surrounded by so much pain and so much tension, we respect each tradition, and we succeed to respect each tradition. We compare, we contrast, and we combine. We do this in many different languages with many different texts. And I think this multifaceted approach is not just one that's part of the ancient past. We do that leading up to the days we live today. And all these studies and periods provide multiple perspectives. So the partners in this conference are evidence of how important it is to hold this conversation is to us. Tantur, the University of Notre Dame, the Center for the Study of Christianity here at the Hebrew University, the Gregorian University in Rome, a partner for many years, and Karma Ben Yohanan's new ERC project, which I'm especially proud of because I had the pleasure of accompanying Karma on that journey. So I want to just conclude by saying that I appreciate that you are all here, members of the clergy, professors, lay people from different institutions in Israel, US, Europe, and of course our keynote speaker who came here from Ireland, a place that also gives some hope when we think about our situation now. So I wish to greet you with a warm welcome. I wish I could have been here because the best part about being dean is learning about people's research and hearing about what they're doing. And I wish I could stay, but no one told me that as new dean, I have to go up on a stage in 12 minutes. So I am leaving you and I am running to that stage, and I will really be looking forward to hearing about the results of this conference and the experiences, and especially the new workshops, ideas, books, articles, whatever you decide to do out of this. I look forward to hearing about that. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Elisheva. Okay, so now it is time to conclude, and since this session is also live streamed, I will start by introducing myself, though you that are sitting here already know me. I'm Karma Ben Yohanan. I teach at the Department of Comparative Religion here at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and also the PI of the ERC project called Christosemitism, Christian Anti-Semitism in Europe between 1945 and 2020. And now for the concluding remarks. The Second Vatican Council, which took place between 1962 and 1965, marked a seismic change in the relationship between the Catholic Church and the modern world. Bishops from all over the world, accompanied by their theological experts, came to Rome to crystallize together a new path for the Church in our extremely complex age. Navigating the extraordinary diversity of the Church and the different, at times polarized perceptions of its leaders, the Council produced a series of 16 documents covering topics from modern critical Bible scholarship to the language of liturgy, from religious freedom to the role of the laity. The Council also devoted considerable space to thinking about and conceptualizing the Church's relations with others, secular society, non-Catholic forms of Christianity, and other religions. Within the Council's document on other religions, Nostra, Aetate, in our time, the fourth section attends to the extremely complex, painful, and intimate relationship of the Church to the Jews, a relationship overshadowed by terrible memories and by the fresh memory of the destruction of European Jewry, captured at the time through the name Auschwitz. This short section is extremely rich. It contains, among other things, a rejection of the deicide charge, that is, the idea that the Jews are collectively guilty of the crucifixion. It rejects the idea that the Jewish people are accursed and rejected by God. It renounces anti-Semitism, and it highlights the Jewish roots of Christianity and the Jewishness of its founding figures. It is also important in what it does not do. It does not call for the conversion of the Jews. It does not address the state of Israel or Middle Eastern politics, nor does it intervene in the controversy over the role the church played or did not play in the history of anti-Semitism and in the extermination of European Jewry. This fourth section, certainly one of the Council's texts that elicited the most heated controversies, initiated a long and non-linear process of self-reflection within the Church, which in turn elicited a non-linear and uneven set of responses within the Jewish world. On the one hand, Nostra, Aetate 4 and its reception are exemplary in their optimism, demonstrating that even the most deeply rooted enmities can be softened and dissolved from within the language of tradition itself. On the other hand, the radical challenges and multiple crises that our societies have experienced since 1965, and most distinctly the challenges we are facing today, including the long and terrible war that began in October 2023 and has taken a devastating human toll, profoundly destabilize this legacy. Jerusalem, naturally, is a central arena for all this complexity, both in its place within Jewish and Christian memory and religious imagination, and in its multi-religious complex present. We are therefore extremely grateful to all of our distinguished speakers, those joining us from close by, and especially those who came from afar, to share their knowledge and reflections and to think about Nostra Aetate and its legacy from within the reality of Jerusalem and with Jerusalem's people. This conference brought together emerging scholars with senior ones, historians and political scientists with theologians and religious studies scholars, who sought to open new paths into Nostra Aetate and also out of it. Some of the speakers have problematized the isolation of Christian-Jewish dialogue from other relationships, proposing new approaches inspired by Hindu and Buddhist-Christian dialogue, or mindful to the competition between post-Holocaust and post-colonial understandings of dialogue. Others have explored the impact of Christianity's transition to the Global South on Jewish-Christian relations, and yet others did not shy away from the thorny questions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the prisms of covenantal theology or alternatively of natural law. And yet others have offered new insights from their extensive archival research on the Jewish interlocutors at the time of the Council, or highlighted the emotive grammar which underlines Jewish approaches to the Church. Either way, this was a joint and interdisciplinary effort to shake existing discourses on Nostra Aetate and explore its legacy in new contexts, without shying away from the still existing tensions, awkwardness, and also prejudices. The opening of such a vibrant, challenging, and diverse conversation is the aspiration of every conference organizer, and I'm so grateful to all of the people who have enabled it. My dear colleague and co-organizer, Professor Johanan Moss, head of the Center for the Study of Christianity, and I are deeply indebted to our partners and co-organizing institutions. First, to our colleague Tzvi Novik, our partner from the University of Notre Dame, and to the following Notre Dame institutes: the Henkel's Lecture Fund in the Franco Family Institute for Liberal Arts and the Public Good, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and the Department for Jewish Studies. We thank also our friends and colleagues from Notre Dame Jerusalem, especially the director, Daniel Schwacke, for their general partnership in the conference's organization and for Tantul's generous hospitality yesterday. We are also grateful to our colleague and good friend, Professor Massimo Gargiulo, head of the Cardinal Bass Center for Jewish Studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University, who has been our collaborative partner for many years, including in this conference. This collaboration has been possible due to the generosity of the wonderful Aldegonde and late Hubert Brenningmeyer Wilhelm. Where is Aldegonde? Oh, it's so good. So good to have you back in Jerusalem. I would also like to extend my thanks to the European Research Council for supporting the project that is also behind this conference. Finally, I want to extend my gratitude to the extraordinary team who supported the event on the administrative level, masterfully solving endless problems and skillfully navigating the rather heavy ship to shore. There are too many to acknowledge by name, but let me mention especially our very dear Phaedra Shapiro, with whom I feel very privileged to work, Alicia Shao from the Notre Dame campus in South Bend, and Kriko Kukeyan from the Tantur campus. And now I'm going to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Massimo Faggioli. And I would like to start by saying that Professor Faggioli is among the most prominent scholars of contemporary Catholicism. He's a professor of ecclesiology at the Loyola Institute at Trinity College Dublin. Until recently, he was professor at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University in Philadelphia. Professor Faggioli is an extremely prolific scholar whose books and essays have been published in more than 10 languages. Among his recent publications, The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, Moving Toward Global Catholicity from 2020, Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States, 2021, the Oxford Handbook of Vatican II, co-edited with Catherine Clifford from 2023, Theology and Catholic Higher Education Beyond Our Identity Crisis, 2024, and most recently, Da Dio a Trump, Crisi Cattolica e Politica Americana, 2025. He is co-editor of Global Catholicism Between Disruption and Encounter, 2024, as well as co-founder and co-editor of the series Studies in Global Catholicism for Brill Publishers. Please note that these are only references to his works from the last 5 years, which is really, it makes every other scholar feel a bit uncomfortable, I think. So you can imagine that there are many more. He's also a contributing writer for Commonweal magazine and for the Italian magazine Il Regno. As the titles of his books imply, Professor Faggioli's work encompasses an enormous spectrum of topics, synthesizing the manifold aspects of the life of the Catholic Church at this time, from its changing place within the American political landscape to the diversification of the Church in the global South, from new Catholic movements to the crisis of reception of the Second Vatican Council, and more. The breadth of his grasp of the modern Church informs also his understanding of Nostra Aetate 4, the Council's section dedicated to Jews and Judaism. And Faggioli's scholarship thus sheds light on the connection between Jewish-Christian dialogue and the broader and enormous challenges with which the Church is confronted today. Professor Faggioli, we are honored and delighted to have you with us today, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am incredibly honored by this invitation, which I see as one of the great honors of my career. I want to thank you, all those who made this conference possible, especially Karma and Tzvi, and all those who have made this incredibly important event at this very delicate time. A short self-introduction is not out of place in discussing a topic which can hardly be treated in a strictly scholarly and dispassionate manner. I'm an Italian church historian and Catholic theologian who specializes in church history and ecclesiology, and who moved back to Europe in Dublin after 17 years in the United States. But I'm also a scholar whose hometown is in Ferrara, Italy, one of the most important cities in the history of Jewry in modern Europe, and now home of the National Museum of Italian Judaism and of the Shoah, which is an attempt of my hometown to work through the catastrophe of the Holocaust, which was made possible by fascism, a movement and a party of which my hometown was one of the cradles. After growing up in Ferrara close to the local group of Jewish Catholic Dialogue, and after 12 years in Bologna, I have rediscovered Nostra Aetate while in the United States, and especially thanks to the networks and individuals that animate Jewish Catholic Dialogue in the United States. These last 2 years have been, for all of us, and myself included, a call to re-examine our relationship and commitment to Nostra Aetate in an unprecedented way. And for this opportunity, I'm deeply grateful beyond my words. So in this lecture, I will try to give a picture of what I think changed since 1965 for Nostra Aetate and for what this means for our interpretation of that document and of that event. And so my remarks are divided in 4 parts, in 4 windows, and every window has different frames. And the first window is global historical shifts. The radical change in the Catholic Church's attitude towards the Jews at Vatican II was due in large part to 3 events that occurred over a period of 20 years. The Holocaust, the birth of the State of Israel, and the global theological event that was the Second Vatican Council. The discussion of the mutual causal connections between these 3 events must be conducted with extreme caution, but it is indisputable that the protagonists of the later events were, in different and sometimes self-absolving ways, aware of the earlier events. And so these events are very different in nature and historical significance, but all of them were part of a history until recently dominated by Europe and by the Western Hemisphere for the Catholic Church. So here, first frame of these global historical shifts. Nostra Aetate from the Cold War to the post-Cold War. Even compared to the 50th anniversary of Vatican II in 2015, today is more evident that we live in a world where we see the effects of the end of the order created in the West by the Cold War, where the coexistence of capitalism, of communism, of many other things seemed permanent, almost metaphysical, and that covered other fractures in our collective consciousness. The Cold War even covered the fractures around different interpretations of the relationship between the Church and Judaism. Now, with the end of the post-Cold War order, we see the end of the West as a concept, as a series of institutions, and so on. This is deeply consequential because it was in the West in which the narrative of Nostra Aetate was located, both for what it said explicitly and for what it chose not to say. As we know, the Conciliar Declaration did not explicitly address the Shoah or the birth of the State of Israel, together with a lack of reference to the previous Catholic theological tradition. The eruption, especially in these last 10 years, of religious and theological post-colonial and decolonial narratives in the mainstream have repositioned the Jewish-Christian relationship in a perspective in which I'm afraid Nostra Aetate is more and more a victim of the potential dismissal of whatever is seen coming from European and Western history. On the other hand, when Nostra Aetate in the West is interpreted in a fundamentalist way, isolated from the rest of Vatican II, from the rest of the Declaration, and of the subsequent developments in Catholic teaching, that reading is more and more at risk of becoming a weapon in the hands of the theological political narratives that now more and more openly flirt with anti-Semitism. Second picture, the Revanche de Dieu, take 2. In the history of the international relations, and in the post-Vatican II path of dialogue between the Church and the Jews, Nostra Aetate functions for Catholic teaching as the foundational first step for an interreligious reconciliation, which was an essential part of the vision for a political international order based on peace among different nations and traditions. The theological developments in Jewish-Catholic relations were seen as a harbinger of the possibility of a larger settlement of interreligious grievances and part of the path towards a more peaceful international order based on a democratic nation-state and multilateralism with all possible qualifications. Now, the last few months tell us a different story. Peace agreements based on political cultures, systems, and leaders that are no longer of the same type of the 20th century liberal international order. Religion today has a renewed political role and a place that is different from the role and a place that it had in the first 50 years of the post-Vatican II. And maybe we could talk about a second Revanche de Dieu or a second phase in the one identified by Gilles Capel 35 years ago. Picture 3, the Middle East is still a key place for Jewish-Christian relations and for Nostra Aetate. And here I use Middle East admitting the colonial and Eurocentric origins of this term. The relationship between 21st century Catholicism and modern Judaism and Israel has become now even more a test for the state of the world and indicative of the chance of healing in the one human family. One of the differences with the 20th century is that today there are many more questions and internal soul searching about the ideological and religious trajectories of the two key political projects, the United States and the State of Israel. Without peace between the Church and the Jews becomes very arduous or impossible. Both America and Israel are, in different ways, theological political projects in which the role of religion in politics and in public life has changed significantly since Nostra Aetate in ways that influence one another and have an impact on Christianity and on Judaism in the whole world. Second window, shifts in the global interreligious relations. The most obvious shift in the perception of interreligious dialogue between the time of the Council and our post-9/11 and post-October 7th 21st century world is that we have moved in the global consciousness from a narrative of a hopeful encounter and dialogue to a narrative of encounter and conflict. And so I think this can be analyzed in 4 different points. 1, the eruption of Islam. The major shift in interreligious relations since Vatican II and an effect of the globalization of interreligious relations in terms both of encounter and clash is the eruption of Islam as a religious and political known quantity on the world map in the 1970s with the passage from Arab nationalism to political Islam and then through the 2 intifadas and until today. In Nostra Aetate paragraph 3, the approach to Islam is mostly aimed at solving past tensions, which has been recalled by one paper today, and with one of the most revelatory statements of the Council about the apparent ease with which the past could be addressed, quote, "This sacred synod urges all to forget the past," end quote. So here, the eruption of Islam could not be solved with forgetting the past, of course, and has 3 distinct dimensions. First, a political dimension at the global level with a militant counter-narrative against globally the liberal Western modern of settlement of the relations between religion and politics known in these last 2 centuries, more or less. Second dimension, a geopolitical dimension with the shift of the balance towards the Middle East and the unsolved tensions left by the colonial order, tensions made more acute by the end of the Soviet Empire, which acted as a moderator or suppressor of Islam as a geopolitical entity. Third dimension, so there is a theological eruption of Islam with the new interpretation of the status of Muhammad vis-a-vis the self-revelation of God in the scriptures. Second frame, Nostra Aetate beyond paragraph 4. The first focus of the project that in 65 became Nostra Aetate was evidently towards the Jewish world. And so this reflected not just the concern to address the history of anti-Semitism, but also expressed a largely European and North American origins of the 20th century Jewish-Christian relations. So there was a very specific question of geography and of space in that attempt. Now, the relations between the church and the Jews could be framed in terms of a friendship as a couple, where the main concern of the council was, and this is very evident towards the end of Nostra Aetate's path, the main concern was to keep in the fold of the Catholic Church those who rejected the condemnation of anti-Semitism. I'm saying this because Nostra Aetate today is a very short blanket. It's a blanket that is not long enough to cover the changes in what interreligious relations and relations with non-Christian religions for a church whose demographic balance has shifted dramatically towards Africa and Asia. Compared to 1965, many more Catholics live in countries where the majority is Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, and where Judaism has been absent or present in ways that are completely different from the history of Europe, of the Americas and the Middle East, with an additional problem, and in an Europe where Christianity is more and more exculturated. And so Nostra Aetate is much more difficult to locate in an exculturated Christianity. Nostra Aetate must also be read in parallel to another very important short and technically minor declaration of the Second Vatican Council on the freedom of religion, the Dignitatis Humanae, and a situation around the world where the freedom of religion for Christians, but not only, is one of the first casualties of the crisis of the liberal state and of the constitutional order. 3, global religions and the end of multilateralism. The system of interreligious relations envisaged by Vatican II and by post-Vatican II teaching relied on some kind of assumption of a system of relations between states in a multilateralist framework. And Nostra Aetate also relied, because Vatican II relied on this, it relied on the assumption that theocracies, integralism, this earthly political messianism were a thing of the past. This is not what we have seen in these last few years. We have a new phase in the rise of the strong political religion in many traditions in different ways. In these last few months, the discourse on religion and politics in the Western world, especially, has been occupied by unscrupulous adventurers and apocalyptic technocrats at the expense of institutional religious leaders and recognized figures in their tradition. And this is part of a larger and deeper crisis in institutional life, with a dramatic collapse of faith in institutions of all kinds, including the church. Now there is a new kind of political religious diplomacy in the hands of short-term political interests and destinies of individuals that are hijacking long-term interreligious relations. All kinds of operators now distort and manipulate the teachings of their own religious tradition in ways that I think interreligious relations now are, as such, are at risk of losing all credibility among believers and even more among our fellow human beings in the one human family. Third window, ecclesial shifts within Catholicism. Nostra Aetate is a fruit of second half of 20th century Catholicism, in which the liberation of new theological and spiritual forces coexisted with a strong sense of belonging to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. If Congar, silence never left. Chenou, silence never left. All of a long series. This sense of belonging has changed greatly. And to paraphrase Grace Davies' famous dictum, I don't think we are just in a believing without belonging situation. So I think we have to read Nostra Aetate in a belonging without believing situation, I think. So here I see a few major shifts within Catholicism. First, how to navigate continuity and discontinuities in papal teaching. The reception of Nostra Aetate has gone through, I would say, more than other documents of Vatican II, and again in a parallel with the Aetate Humanae, a situation of perceived instability of papal teaching on Judaism and on Jewish-Catholic relations. So on the one hand, it's undeniable that there has been a real difference, for biographical reasons, in the investment by different popes in a theological and ecclesial reception of Nostra Aetate since 1965. On the other hand, different and sometimes opposing narratives about the alignment of the teaching of this or that pope with a particular theological agenda has created, I think, unnecessary turbulence around the space of Nostra Aetate. So we have seen this lately with this change of pontificate, when some prominent voices after the death of Pope Francis have manifested openly a nostalgia for Pope Benedict's high theological sensibility to the hermeneutics of the documents of the Second Vatican Council and of Nostra Aetate. Now, understandable as this nostalgia might be, and so the papacy is a very affectionate affair, this nostalgia tends to forget, in my humble opinion, some incidents like the old missal for the Latin Mass and the prayer of the Jews in 2008, but also forgets, I think, some of the unintended consequences of Pope Benedict's pontificate for the rise of the new anti-Vatican II movement. I repeat, unintended consequences, but this, I think, it's part of what has happened in these last 20 years. Second, the disappearing voice of authority of church leaders and of theologians. So there's a vertical crisis of authority of theologians in public conversations about religion and also in the eyes of church authorities. So this is particularly evident in the United States, where influencers with millions of followers on social media, like, for example, Michael J. Matt of The Remnant, recently describing on social media Nostra Aetate as, quote, the Vatican Zionist Pact, part of the view of Vatican II as a deep state with clear anti-Semitic undertones. And so that's just one of the many possible examples one could choose in what has become a Catholic neo-traditionalism, which is different from the traditionalism of the early post-Vatican II period. So this is a problem that goes way beyond social media. It's part also of the end of the monopoly or of some kind of influence on biblical interpretation by Catholic hierarchical and intellectual authorities. one consequence is that there is a crisis in the historical critical method, which sometimes entails the rebuke of the idea that Jesus was Jewish, but also normalizes new and old forms of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in various ways. So this is very important because these viruses of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism are no longer under the control, and I would say often not even under the microscope of the institutional church at the local or the national level. It's part of the problem that Nostra Aetate and all of it and all that has remained largely a top-down dialogue, has touched the people in the pews, as we say, only marginally, and has triggered and has caused a lack of reaction, a lack of antibodies against the rise of an anti-liberal political Catholicism, which is, and we have seen this in the last few weeks, openly flirting with anti-Semitism in a proud way, not an embarrassed way, in a very proud way. 3, the new mix within politically militant Catholicism. In some local churches, like in the US, but not only, in the second phase of the post-Vatican II period, which I would say starts after the 1990s, there has been an influx of converts to Catholicism, and I say this with all possible respect. My wife is a convert to Catholicism. Some of them are high-profile converts, public intellectuals, journalists, commentators, politicians, whose embrace of Catholicism has often overt political meanings. So this has brought in the church a new energy, which is very important, but also a sensibility towards Vatican II and Nostra Aetate that is often very different from the one of those who made the council and those who made the post-Vatican II ordinary cradle Catholics. In some cases, this new kind of very intentional anxiety-led decisions has brought back and rehabilitated forms of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. In some cases, that's not typical, but this has happened. And so this is a new kind of situation that, as a church historian like me, reminds for the controversies it has generated, especially in this last decade, something like the debate on the lapsi in the early centuries of the church under the Roman Empire. 4, intra-Catholic ecumenism and culture war political ecumenism. It has been said today, and I totally agree, that there has been a transition from a theological neoconservatism to a neo-traditionalism within the church, which is a parallel of the transition from a classical political conservatism to what we see now as a nationalist, a Christianist populism in different countries. In the United States, culture war Catholics and culture war Protestant evangelicals have merged in a way that has sidelined often 20th century ecumenism as well as the Jewish-Christian dialogue inspired by Nostra Aetate. Jewish-Catholic dialogue in a culture war vein seems to be much more concerned about instrumentalizing dialogue in the service of a particular political agenda than in pursuing the kinds of religious and theological issues that have featured in the Jewish-Christian dialogue over the last 6 decades. The project is about uniting politically conservative Catholics with conservative Jews. And so these new projects and their supporters put themselves forward in a very effective way as the real, authentic voice when it comes to the Jewish-Christian relations, and to subtly or not subtly, to sideline or shunt aside those who have been doing this work of dialogue for many decades, including the Vatican, and including those who have spent their entire lives on that. Fourth and final window, the theological shifts. With Nostra Aetate, the Catholic Church abandoned the goal of converting Jews, rejected the accusation of deicide moved against Jews, and only began to overcome supersessionist theology. As Pope Benedict XVI recalled, quote, God's gifts are irrevocable and the covenant with Israel endures. It was a huge step which ushered in a totally different climate in the relationship with Christianity, end quote. But alongside the progress, limitations and necessary ambiguities remain. One, a continuity and discontinuity in the theological tradition. Nostra Aetate had to adopt, by necessity, something like a sola scriptura approach in relation to its sources because of the uselessness of the previous tradition in this particular matter. So today, we do not have to adopt the sola scriptura anymore. We don't have that problem anymore. So we have Nostra Aetate, and we have all that happened in these last 60 years. But I think that this works only if we admit or readmit in the Catholic discourse on the interpretation of Nostra Aetate that there are some kind of discontinuities, in the plural, within one fundamental continuity with the one subject church. That's not rupture, it's some discontinuities within the major continuity. I think that a theology of the Jewish Catholic dialogue that excludes the admissibility of any possible literal discontinuity in this tradition is either lying to itself or it's preparing unconsciously steps back from the achievements of the Second Vatican Council. So this is part, I think, of a larger problem of what kind of politics of the past we have in the church, and a particularly nefarious politics of the past is to see the expression, quote, the spirit of Vatican II, an expression that many popes since 1965 have used officially, is to see that idea that there is a spirit of Vatican II not just as past, but as passé, as something that is no longer in fashion, and we should just forget about that. And this, a very similar problem we have, again, in the rift within the hermeneutics at a certain level of the public debate for Dignitatis Humanae. Very similar problems. Second, supersessionism and ecclesiology. This neo-traditionalist politics of the past has brought back new forms of a new supersessionist movement. So despite the enormous amount of reflection, I think it must be noted with sincerity that within the Catholic context and Christian context, a shared theological paradigm has not yet emerged that can replace the supersessionist theology and the related subordinate and testimonial role which was attributed to the Jewish people. Two cornerstones that for many centuries have formed the backbone of the Christian view of the Jews. This is very difficult, and it's very difficult because to achieve a genuine and complete abandonment of replacement theology, it is not enough to pursue the dialogical path centered on Jewish Christians encounters or discussions. Nor would it be enough to develop a theological reflection on the Jewish people as a non-Christian religion. The definitive paradigm shift would, I think, in fact, imply the development of a new ecclesiology, which is not exactly the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council. 3, the land of Israel and the state of Israel. One of the major questions resolutely and strategically avoided at Vatican II, as you all know, concerned the theological statute of Zionism, the land of Israel, and the state of Israel. Now, relations with the Vatican have long been problematic, and in part still are, despite the avoidance to include these elements that are not present in Nostra Aetate. Even more complicated in the theological map of the different positions in global Catholicism about the statute of the Jewish state. So the state of Israel now is no longer a universal taboo in Jewish Catholic dialogue. But I think that the different views have become more evidently more difficult to reconcile. So there's a very interesting emerging literature of manuals, of handbooks, of Christian and Catholic theology, of Zionism, and of Israel. So Israel, as a state, and the land are emerging as a theological issues. And I think it must be acknowledged here that there is a significant difference between an Anglo-American Catholic theology, which is more comfortable talking about Catholic Zionism, and a European continental Catholic theological landscape, which I think is very much afraid of that. It is, anyway, the public conviction on both sides that the whole idea, the whole concept of Israel as a land, as a state, for Christians, for Catholics, now must be rethought, or it is being in the process of being rethought in ways that the theological conversation struggles to acknowledge, and for totally self-evident reasons, the official Catholic teaching doesn't want to acknowledge, for very good reasons, I think. 4, doing theology after Gaza. The Catholic theological conversation is not immune from the calls to think theologically about the war against Israel and the war conducted by Israel, especially in these last 2 years after the October the 7th attacks by Hamas. So in short, as it has been mentioned this afternoon, Gaza as a locus theologicus, the whole categorization of the war as a genocide against Palestinians or not, these are questions that are on the table, that are there, and denying them would be dishonest. And so this is why this conference has been important in trying to talk about these incredibly difficult things. So the theological reflections on Gaza, after Gaza, coming from the global south, from the left, from the woke culture, are posing questions to the theology of the Jewish Catholic dialogue. Questions like an even more urgent wake-up call to decolonize theology, to rethink the loyalties and bondage of the church towards empire, the British Empire first, the American Empire later, as part of a further stage in the history of liberation theology. So here, this call to think what it means doing theology after Gaza, after these last 2 years, is even more important and far above the partisan narratives, because I think it expresses the desire to overcome a perceived and a shocking realization of how incapable we still are to read history theologically. It's the end of the 20th century illusion that we had learned from history. So here, that these things will never happen again. So this is a shocking moment. So here, the identification of a particular turning point, these last 2 years, questions a number of key issues, especially the uniqueness of the Holocaust. It's a further challenge to our ability to read history in light of God's plan or of a certain arc of history. And it's also another big chapter in the history of theodicy. 5, political theology and the constitutional order. Post-Vatican II Jewish-Catholic dialogue took place in that golden age of the post-1945 and the post-Cold and in the Cold War liberal order and the early post-Russian Empire. In his last essay, one of the most important church historians in Italy in this last century, Paolo Prodi, wrote this in 2017. Quote, the Jewish Semitic world has become a prime case, the cutting edge of the West's attempt to reconcile, as some still think it's possible, to reconcile an ongoing process of confessionalization of public life with the full guarantees of the Bill of Rights, end quote. That attempt is now in evident crisis in both Catholicism and in Judaism, at least in their most militant embodiment. Also, if not especially, in those parts of the world where lies the demographic future of the Catholic Church. This makes a difference for a Jewish-Catholic dialogue and relations that at Vatican II and in the early post-Vatican II period took for granted the principles of religious liberty, in theory at least, a distinction, if not separation, between church and state and religion and politics. This is no longer the mainstream view. I think it's a marginal view. 6 and last, paragraph 4 and the rest. For decades, Nostra Aetate was read and experienced primarily as the text that marked a decisive shift in the relationship between the Church and Judaism. It still is. Today, however, the emphasis is much more on dialogue with all religions, and on the 60th anniversary, this is something to reflect on. Now, I think we have 2 risks. One risk is to reduce Nostra Aetate to Jewish-Catholic dialogue alone, and the other risk is to reduce Jewish-Catholic dialogue as just one part of the wider picture of the relations with non-Christian religions. So this is a very difficult balance, and I have no answer on this, but I think there's that clearly on this table. So I think this is important for those who work in academia, in university, and so on, because this difficult balance must be seen in light of some, I think, generous but naive and sometimes misguided efforts at diversification in interpretation of our theology, of Nostra Aetate, and so on. So here, diversifying may satisfy a certain preferential option for the non-Judeo-Christian, for the non-Western. And it is absolutely necessary to explore our much more global church and much more global world. But I think, or I'm afraid, it would unconsciously serve the agenda of ultimately undermining Nostra Aetate and Vatican II as a whole, sweeping away every possible space for diversity and all of that. A few words of conclusion now. So these remarks try to show some of the gaps that we need to acknowledge and bridge when we read Nostra Aetate from their age to ours. This might lead to see that considered the declaration as passé, or even worse, dépassé. The end of Nostra Aetate as something sanctioned by the events of these last 20 years, of these last 2 years. Now, I think this is, the picture is much more hopeful than you might have inferred from the previous 40 minutes. So the attempt made during the Council era to embark on the path of genuine openness towards the Jewish people, while keeping in the background, hidden somewhere, some of the principal reasons that led to that shift, the Holocaust, the land, the state of Israel, was a compromise, both historically understandable and destined to be short-lived. Nostra Aetate was the beginning of a new page, but based on the relationship with Judaism as a problem of biblical exegesis and of interpretation of the existing tradition. Now, it is evidently our problem that there is a theological issue of making a tradition. And what to make of what we have just made yesterday, the last pope, and so on. So this observation in no way changes the fundamental role played by Vatican II. With regard to the Jewish people, Vatican II brought about a turning point from which there is no turning back. Even if, with the passage of time, the limits of that attempt and on Nostra Aetate become apparent. As Pope Leo XIV said on October 29th, quote, "It should not be forgotten that the first focus of Nostra Aetate was towards the Jewish world, with St. John the 23rd, intended to reestablish the original relationship. For the first time in the history of the Church, a doctrinal treatise on the Jewish roots of Christianity was to take shape, which on a biblical and theological level would represent a point of no return," end quote. So Nostra Aetate is still, and more than ever, required reading. But it is not sufficient to do justice to the dialogue among us in the one human family. Finally, Vatican II and Nostra Aetate were much more than documents. It was an event. It was an agenda that Catholics cannot use as a shield to protect ourselves from the accountability of the promises made at Vatican II in that event of grace that was Vatican II. Thank you very much.
We need a moment to digest, I think.
Hermeneutic of silence.
I'll start.
Sure.
As a non-academic and somebody who's involved in dialogue with the Vatican representing the Jewish community, so very practically, what are the issues that we Jews should be putting on the table with the Vatican? What questions should we be asking them? What should we be pushing them on in light of regarding the presentation that you just made? What are the next practical steps to try to save the past 60 years?
So don't quote me on that, but so one question that I think is number one is to make them know that you know that there is a crisis in the lived knowledge and experience of the Second Vatican Council. So I think that one key issue is we cannot save Nostra Aetate by itself, because once you get rid of other documents, it will be swept away. And so here, I think they know that, but it would be helpful for them to know that you know that there's something like this going on, for various reasons. Because there's been a certain Vatican II culture that was and sometimes indulging with the veterans' sentimentality. from the 60s and so on. So here there is a whole package that is Vatican II, all those documents, but also what happened there. So here, Nostra Aetate, from an historical point of view, is something that wasn't supposed to happen. So it's a miracle, because it's a survivor of the council. So it survived multiple attempts to be suppressed, to be sidelined, to be reduced to a footnote, and so on. So this is what I would tell them. So not to have them say nice things on Nostra Aetate, okay? But on Dignitatis Humanae, on Gaudium et Spes, on Dei Verbum. So here, I mean, my good friend and colleague Ethan Schwartz, I don't know if he's listening, but so he taught me that Nostra Aetate, in some sense, is not as interesting theologically as Dei Verbum from a Jewish point of view. But now, when you have a new fundamentalist approach to scripture within the church, chapter and verse, and so on, I mean, all of that is in Nostra Aetate will be swept away. So that's how I would do that. Yeah, thank you.
Massimo.
First of all, thank you. It was not a paper, a tractate about the contemporary world, I would say. There is a problem, I think, that connects with what Ken was saying before. The shift in the church, and not only in the geography, but also in the demography and in the political vision of the church. For example, I think of the new seminarians who are mostly young men who search for a strong identity, also from a religious point of view, kind of catechetical approach to religion. So I completely agree with you about the necessity of defending not only Nostra Aetate, but the whole of the spirit of Vatican II. My question is, who is going to do that if the church is changing so much and in a direction that somehow can seem opposed to the spirit of Vatican II itself?
That's an excellent question. So I think that the church, for various reasons, is still structured in a way that is unique in terms of the possibilities of having the voice of the Pope heard, of some leaders, right? So in ways that have few parallels, I think, in traditions, right? So we all had Vatican II popes, no question about that. So in different ways, but all of them were very much invested in that. And so this is still happening. So I think I would be curious to know how much they talk about this in the seminar for the so-called baby bishops, right? So the new bishops that are. So that's a big question because so here Vatican II was not the intellectual luxury of the Western world in the magic 30 years between 45 and 75 and so on. It's the condition of existence of the church everywhere. I mean, a non-fundamentalist approach to scripture, a certain idea of the healthy relationship, politics and religion. So it's the DNA. And so the big problem is that we are taking for granted all of that, but once you make that experiment in a lab of taking out of how you are a Catholic, how you teach Catholic theology, I mean, how you preach on Sunday. If you take out Dei Verbum, if you take out Nostra Aetate, if you take out, it's a monster that comes out. And not because pre-Vatican II Catholicism was a monster, but because now it would be a monster. Right? So I'm not saying that the pre-Vatican II church was obscure, bad people. I'm not saying that at all. But right now, it would be like a Frankenstein Catholicism now. Right? And so it's not about a liberal agenda. It's about the intellectual, spiritual sustainability of a big communion of faith in a multicultural world. And so the Vatican has still a voice. I believe that a certain attempt to overthrow the status quo theologically will fail pretty soon if it's in the hands of some characters that are acting as theologians in chief of the administration. So I think we should invest on the long run, on the next 10, 20 years. That's a very important window, I think.
It's just that I did this training for baby bishops last year.
And? Don't tell me, don't tell me.
It sort of half fits and half doesn't with what you said.
Okay.
The three main aspects was a long part on evangelization.
Okay.
Another part about how we don't know what our stance is on the relation between theology and politics, and that we need to work on this. That was an interesting question.
Sure.
It was a very wide open question. And third thing was a lot of canon law about the abuse.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that's. I should have mentioned this, that this is one of the big factors that has really sent an earthquake in the institutional stability, even in Vatican II, which, as we know now, failed to address that issue. So yes.
I'm sorry, I missed that issue.
Of the abuse crisis.
Oh, the abuse crisis.
Yeah. Sexual, yes.
Gavin.
It was a very short statement, so I'd just like you to elaborate on it. Because you said that, if I understood you right, Nostra Aetate said no more mission. And I wasn't quite sure whether you were meaning that about all of the religions, or did I?
No. Not, we shouldn't convert Jews anymore. Just that, to Christianity, right? So that's it was not about mission, okay? It's about conversion of Jews to Christianity. After Nostra Aetate, this has become, in my opinion, one of the things that has been accepted widely, that we shouldn't encourage anymore that in any way. That's
Yes. You. Yeah, I don't remember your name.
As a convert to Catholicism from Judaism, I see that there is this the church institution tries to minimize Jewish converts to Catholicism and actually pushes some away. But the fact is that there are converts to Catholicism from Judaism, from both secular and religious backgrounds. And not only to Catholicism, but to Orthodox Christianity as well, which did not go through the process of Vatican II at all. And I know some of my Israeli friends, young 20-year-olds who convert to Catholicism, to Greek Orthodoxy. I mean, there's like a whole movement now undercover. So I'm wondering, what is your stance towards converts? Whether that's something that Catholics should just say, don't convert, you know?
No.
Or it should be more open to that. And specifically, what about the Orthodox Church? Because it's attracting people despite the fact that it's not open to any ecumenism, at least the Greeks.
So yes, I should measure my words very carefully here. So in some sense, I see myself as a convert in some sense, because American Catholicism converted me in some ways. Yeah, I mean, opened my eyes on things that I would have never seen as a European Catholic. I have to say that. Second, as I said, I mean, my wife converted to the Catholic Church. I mean, was baptized at the age of 28. I was the sponsor for her baptism, and thank God they changed canon law, because in the old canon law I would not have been able to marry her. And so, but now in the new canon law you can be a sponsor of baptism and marry this person, so I was able to marry her. So the question is, and so this has been acknowledged recently also in a very honest way by the Cardinal of Marseille, right? So we have a very vital movement of people who have discovered Jesus. We need to help them discover the church. So our faith is a faith in a church. It's not one-on-one seminar, webinar, Zoom session with, right? So there's an ecclesial component, right? So here I hope that there is a continuation of meaning-seeking movement on that. I mean, I strongly believe, so I was born in 1970. It was clear who were the good guys, the bad guys, the Russians, the Americans, and so on. So my world was very clear. And right now, good luck with that. So I think I'm not against that at all. I think that there has, so as bad as it is, the academic presumption that I'm an academic, I'm teaching you XYZ, there's been also something like that from another cathedra. I am a convert, so I'm telling you what real Catholicism is, and to be very honest, in the United States between 2013 and 2025, much of my job was to tell Catholics that Pope Francis was Catholic. No, literally, which is something that I would have never expected. And also coming from Italy, where, I mean, historically Italians see in the Pope more like the tax collector than the Bishop of Rome. So we have, and so I was the unlikeliest person to defend the Catholicity of the Pope. But this is what has happened. So here there has to be, and I've learned, thanks to some of my converts friends, that no one should have the ipse dixit. I tell you that, so that's true, end of the discussion, right? But, so this is mixed because in a church where certain platforms have elevated some voices just because they come from that path, this has created new magisteria for which there's no canonical definition, there's no guidelines really. So, yeah, that's what I want to say.
And the Orthodox Church?
Wait a minute, but there are
I-
others. Yeah, okay.
So there's a very good, interesting reportage in the New York Times of today on the incredibly growing number of converts within the Orthodox Church in the United States. It captures what's happening. It's a little different for them, I think, than for the Catholic Church, but there are many similarities. That's what I should say.
I'm going to use my.
Privilege.
Okay, so for two questions. That's that. So first of all, I want to follow up on what your conversation with Rabbi Drach that asked what should we do, and you said let them know that you know, but I'm not sure that they know sometimes, and I think the example, I already mentioned this in one of the sessions, was, I don't know if you follow this ceremony of Nostra Aetate that was in the Vatican with the reason Christ was behind, and then you had a little choir of children singing Imagine, right? Imagine.
I apologize for that.
It wasn't even ironic. It was, which was really, I didn't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
And then there was, again, this huge diversity, and the Jews. separately. It was very separate. Then you really saw that also the administrative separation between the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews and the interreligious, that there is no thinking on how to connect between these things. And I'm wondering, so of course everybody knows that there is a crisis, but do you think they understand that Jewish-Christian relations is part of this crisis of globalization and politicization, or this is not at all on the agenda? That's the first question.
Okay, so I think some people know for sure. So I don't know how high up they are, so I mean how their voice is located. Last night, Pope Leo gave a very interesting statement when he was asked, well, what kind of trips he has in mind, and he basically said, what I'm doing right now, every day, is just to follow the schedule of the Jubilee. Mm-hmm. And we will start planning something by myself that I want to do next year. And so that event, I think, was part of that thing. So until recently, you had a certain kind of theological establishment in the Vatican, German theology, English. This is changing, and so it is difficult to identify which commission, which interlocutors. It's not obvious that those who are in charge necessarily are on top of everything. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can here, but so it's a difficulty. Not, I mean, for all of us, even for Catholics. That's not just for ad extra. It's more than that, I think.
So this connects well with the other question, and this is again going to the global south, but maybe not only to the global south. If there is a profound change in terms of authority, especially intellectual authority, so not the Pope, but the theologians perhaps. And I'm wondering if you can identify the non-Western forces that could partner Jews, perhaps not on the question of Israel-Palestine, but that there is some kind of an opening to shift the relationship to these places and to these challenges on part of Jews?
That's a very difficult question, and I really don't know. I wouldn't know where to start, and so it requires a very careful analysis. This is a key strategic problem there. I would say to take a step back, and when you look at your interlocutors in Europe, in the Western world, I think it's important to identify those who have maintained a certain sense of the importance of the Second Vatican Council. Because once academics start saying, well, Vatican II was a bunch of celibate bishops, or it was a Western Church event, why should we care about that? My suggestion is say something to them, or find someone else. Because if that crisis deepens in those parts of the world that are biographically closer to Nostra Aetate, I think the whole problem becomes more complicated. That's how I would see it, and so Catherine Cornell, so other experts know where there are in India, in Africa. It's way beyond my level of expertise.
Thank you so much. Seriously? Silvana.
For the final, the liberal agenda of the necessity of keeping the liberal agenda of the Church in order to preserve the theology of Vatican II, but we are today mentioning that the Church is changing, but the reality is that third world theologians are most of the time the opposite of
Well, you're right. So here, I mean, what liberal means would be a whole different thing. But, so I think that there is within Vatican II a core of ideas that are a mix of the gospel, of the ressourcement, of the enlightenment. It's a mix of things. And so one of the typical problems is to reject Vatican II because it was a liberal sellout. It was more about Kant than about Jesus and all of that. So I think this is a misreading of that. And so there are local crises in the reception in every continent. And so this is not just North America and so on. So my appeal would be to those who show a proud dismissal, or to say, you don't know that you are a Vatican II theologian, Vatican Catholic, but think what you would be, what you would say, in absence of all of that. And it's a world, and it's a church where I don't think you want to live. Because it's a reconstruction of a past that was largely imaginary, right? So everyone, I mean, as Dorothy Day said, everyone wants to make the revolution, but no one wants to do the dishes. And so Vatican II was a little bit of a revolution, right? But a lot of it is doing the dishes. So day by day, so showing that if you think that that stoning homosexuals is not the Christian thing to do, well, in some ways that's because you have adopted an hermeneutics of the Second Vatican Council and so on, right?
Not stoning, but most of them will think that the homosexuality should be out of the Catholic space.
Sure, well, I'm not sure I should say that, but I think we are in a new age of heresies and neo-Donatism and neo-Gnosticism, Marcionism of different kinds. And so we cannot call them heresies for various reasons, legal and otherwise. But there is a problem that once you had a fairly clear idea of what was the approved or the mainstream, right? Now, the internet and social media have legitimized incredible kind of stuff. I mean, it's really mind-boggling. So that has a huge influence on young people. And so we are working against incredible forces, right, now. So I think that real work pays out, and I don't think that those influencers will keep running as they do now for a long time. So I see that there is a crisis of social media and so on. So there's a lot of work to do, but what the church officially has done to build on the tradition of the Second Vatican Council is really an enormous accomplishment. It shouldn't be taken for granted. It has cost enormous energies to martyrs, individuals. It's a history that makes possible for us today to be in this shared room now, which was not possible in the age when my parents were students, for example, a short time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation, and I want to go back to what you touched upon about the generational gap, the young generation. I live in Sweden, where most of the newcomers to Catholicism are young what should be done to reverse these trends?
So questions keep getting more difficult as you forecast. But so one thing that I've learned with my students in the United States is to approach the issue indirectly. So for example, so I would never teach now a course called Vatican II. So you have to start from something that they care about and say, well, you care about this because you have inherited something, you have received something, right? So here the worst mistake that we have made, that I have made personally for some years, is to think that they were part of the same romance with the Second Vatican Council, with Cardinal Bea, with Pope John, and so on. So I've learned, in time I hope, that there's something that you can get to them without starting like a documentary on the Civil War, something like that, right? So a long time ago. So to avoid those were the good times, to avoid we were the heroes, or my masters were the heroes. That's not working. So, and in the end, I hope they can learn something on Pope John, the 23rd, who's my hero, on Cardinal Bea and so on, but at the end, right? So not start from the pantheon of these heroes, because it might work with a very small fraction. So here, so I'm not denying these are tough times. So we are working against the grain, against, I do believe that there is no possibility for the Catholic Church to work without Vatican II. And in some cases we have seen that, in some incidents and so on. So that's how you, so if you tell them, do you own a Bible? You read the Bible? Well, that was not possible before Vatican II. Welcome, right? So I mean, just starting from these things, which are minimal, but so I think they can get that. Okay, so you're part of a small Christian movement, Christian community. Well, until Vatican II, you had to be underground. Your bishop would not have been happy with you at all. If you can do that now, it's because Vatican II opened spaces for that. Just examples.
All right, so this was really an extraordinary finale for the for the conference. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And for this talk.